The way that video games depict war is something that I've written about fairly often at digitallydownloaded.net, but it's not something that I've done a video on just yet. It is a topic that I care about a great deal though, and I figured that now would be a good time to have this discussion, as I've recently read an article that really got me thinking. Over at Kotaku, Luke Plunkett recently wrote a piece titled "Hey History Games, the Nazis were the bad guys," in relation to his experience with Panzer Corps II, a war simulation strategy game. Early on, it looked like Plunkett was going to argue that games shouldn't allow you to play as the Nazis, which, in the context of dry historical simulation, would have been a stance that I took issue with. Instead, it turned out to be a piece looking more at the tone in which the Nazis were treated in the game, and having not played Panzer Corps II, I can't comment on that, but in theory I do agree that any game that allows you to play as the Nazis should really be considerate of context. However, on a whim, I looked up Plunkett's writing about Call of Duty as another series that is infamous for its treatment of war, and it turns out that he's quite a fan. It's many years ago now, but back in 2011 he wrote a provocative headline, "Why It's Stupid to Hate Call of Duty So Damn Much," and he has continued his coverage of the series in the years since, without much by way of comment about that series' tone or its treatment of historical military forces. The reason here is obvious: you play as Western and largely American soldiers in Call of Duty, and Luke doesn't seem to have much of a problem with that. But the attitude is something to be concerned about, and not so much with Plunkett himself, but the way that we all look at these military shooters. Because the reality is that Call of Duty, Battlefield, and the overwhelming majority of military shooters position Western forces as lights in the darkness, which is an actual title of Call of Duty Black Ops 4 trailer. And that is deeply problematic in itself. And it's concerning that many people, not just Plunkett, don't seem to have an issue with that or even recognise what's going on. To start to explain what I mean here, I need to tell a personal story first. I actually used to be a big fan of military shooters, and in fact military films as well. Medal of Honor Frontline on the GameCube was on high rotation for me for a very long period of time. What happened to change things was that on a trip to Japan, I went to an art gallery that was holding an exhibition of Japanese war paintings from World War II. I can't remember the specific reason that the exhibition was being put on, but it was to do with some major date in the context of the history of the war. In fact, from memory now, trying to think back, it might have been a certain number of years since the war ended. But whatever the reason, the gallery had this massive collection of paintings that survived the war, and walking through the gallery, in the context of what we know about Japan during World War II, it was a really sobering experience. What was most sobering of all was the aesthetic and tone of the paintings on display. These grand, massive, ceiling-to-floor paintings in many cases were magnificently detailed depictions of the horrors of war and had an overwhelming light-in-the-darkness message to them. This was deliberate, and the Japanese used these war paintings as nationalist propaganda at the time, as academic Karen Bresci noted in Propaganda Painted by Masters, Japanese Art and Photography During the 15-Year War. The majority of these paintings were yoga paintings, that is, paintings painted in the Western style of oil on canvas, Bresci noted. Depicting scenes with depth, perspective and realism, yoga paintings were celebrated by the Japanese military for their realism, a key quality of art that was supposed to document and be a monument to the war for generations to come. The Japanese state needed to use art to depict a new reality, one that would be immortalized primarily in the large-scale works that were painted by the masters. As a Westerner, to look at these paintings that heroized the war effort from the perspective of the Japanese, it struck me as something to be uncomfortable about. But it wasn't unfamiliar, and on further reflection I have come to realize why. Those paintings could have been slapped on a Call of Duty or Battlefield box, and it would have been entirely thematically and aesthetically appropriate. What is written up as propaganda and derided, criticized and dismissed when we talk about the Japanese artists of that era is today being celebrated for being works that depict gritty authenticity, realism, and a realistic take on the horrors of war in Western entertainment. Critically, war propaganda does not actually celebrate war. War propaganda depicts heroism in the face of extreme adversity. Oftentimes, the likes of Call of Duty and Battlefield get a free pass by critics because they depict the horrors of war, and therefore In the minds of many of those critics, they are effectively subversive to war, but that is not how it works. The light in the darkness theme, that is the cornerstone of most war propaganda, is by very definition a depiction of nobility and heroism in the most horrific of circumstances. War propaganda aims to galvanize a population behind a war effort by showing just how desperate the struggle is when the world around the heroes has gone to hell. Now, very few people talk about the likes of Call of Duty or Battlefield as war propaganda beyond the assumption that the light in the darkness theme is subversive. There is one exception. There was a lot of discussion that occurred over whether the recent Call of Duty Modern Warfare was propaganda, because it took an American war crime that is still in living memory, the Highway of Death from the Iraq War in 1991, and wrote it into the game as a war crime perpetuated by the Russian forces. Yes, that game takes place in a fictional Middle Eastern setting, but the reference was explicit, and fictional or not, was absolutely and quite blatantly a reference to a real-world history event. This bit of revisionism did generate a lot of discussion, but I would suggest that that's only because the event is in recent memory. There are people that you can talk to about it, and even YouTube video clips depicting the incident. When it comes to older conflicts, such as World War II, seeing propaganda as propaganda becomes much more difficult, because the passage of time has fuzzied memories, because those involved with the war are pretty much no longer with us, and because we are reliant on history books and the media to explain to us what actually went on through that war. That makes things difficult, because as much as people are conditioned to believe that history is an objective pursuit, and historians work to a noble calling to simply repeat facts in full context, that doesn't actually happen. History is a mixture of research and interpretation, and while you can pile up first-hand sources, such as letters, speeches, photos and newspaper reports, the tapestry that you get from bringing them together will typically be very different to the conclusions that someone else arrives at. On top of that, you have to contend with the reality that it's the victors that write the narrative, and those victors always see history as a weapon for propaganda. It does not suit them to also mention the stuff that they did that was not so heroic. So to talk about World War II specifically, the Axis absolutely needed to lose the war. There are very, very few people, including those within the defeated nations, that would suggest otherwise. But to extrapolate that to mean that those fighting on the other side were infallible heroes, and those lights in the darkness that we keep talking about, is to reduce history to binary goodies and baddies. And while the propaganda would have you believe that to be a record of history, it doesn't quite work like that. To give you just a tiny couple of examples, the political leadership of the Allies was not above criticism. Stalin's Soviet Union fought in the war on the side of the Allies, and he is one very easy person to criticize, even in terms of the conduct through World War II. Another example is if you look into Winston Churchill, the leader of the English. He was an imperialist and racist, deeply racist. Meanwhile, America's use of nuclear bombs should never go uncriticized, because America deliberately chose targets that would cause the maximum number of civilian casualties, not military, but civilians, and the reason to drop the bombs at all is deeply suspect. The Soviets, having dealt with Hitler, had just entered the war in the Pacific, and the Japanese leadership was preparing to surrender. America could see that the window was shutting on its opportunity to demonstrate to the world just how powerful its new weapons were. Now, you could make the argument that Call of Duty and Battlefield are stories of soldiers on the ground, and fair enough, but here again, the positioning of the Allied predominantly American soldiers as knights of shining armour and a light in the darkness in these games is deeply problematic. A book written by Mary Louise Roberts called What Soldiers Do, Sex and the American GI in World War II France chronicles the behaviour of American soldiers towards women in liberated France, and they could get very, very rapey. And that was to the population of an ally. Occupied Germany and Japan had to contend with to the victors go the spoils as well, and the Japanese government was so concerned about how widespread this would become that they opened and managed brothels that they pressured a lot of women to work in. And again, this is by no means an excuse for the Axis power through World War II, and I have to be absolutely clear about that because otherwise I know somebody's going to misinterpret me. They did absolutely abhorrent things at great scale, and they needed to lose that war. But to allow modern propagandists, like the developers at Activision or even the Hollywood filmmakers, to just paper over the reality of what the Allies did through that war is dangerous. It's dangerous because it drives this culture of military hero worship, where every soldier is treated like a Captain America, and every cause they fight in is therefore just. It also acts as soft power diplomacy, a way for Americans to remind the world that they're the good guys, and therefore everything they do is for the good, even though that is patently not the case. To see all of that in motion, you just need to look at people like Luke Plunkett, who can be deeply uncomfortable with the depiction of Nazis as even mildly entertaining in a generally dry military strategy simulator, but can then turn around and accept Call of Duty or Battlefield as grand entertainment. Remember, back in World War II, the many Japanese that looked at those technically majestic paintings were every bit as nonplussed about what those paintings were telling them as we are when we look at Call of Duty or Battlefield today. And every time we see somebody celebrate Dunkirk or 1917 for the brilliant cinematography or the kind of majestic American war story that they're telling, we should remember that just as those films are technically brilliant depictions of cinematic brilliance, so too was Triumph of the Will, a propaganda documentary in support of Hitler that film students still watch because, as completely abhorrent as we find the message today, it is a masterpiece of filmmaking. And once again, Hitler's supporters would have found that film to just be incredible, not abhorrent, incredible. The insidious thing about propaganda is that if it is propaganda for your position, you never see it as such. You see it as entertainment. You see it as information or a documentary. You don't see it as propaganda. It's only when it's in opposition to you that you start to see what these things are actually saying and doing. I'll finish with a quote from a masterpiece bit of film criticism by William Goldman, who put Saving Private Ryan right in his sights at one point. Patriotism and the flag are, and easy answers galore. Phony and manipulative, all in the sense of country. Video games don't treat war well. Video games, as we make them today, are propaganda for war. They are, just like in Saving Private Ryan, phony and manipulative, designed to poke you to believe that while war is hell and these poor soldiers are going through nightmares that no one should experience, it's all okay in the end because they're heroes in the service of their country. This isn't to say you can't enjoy the likes of Battlefield and Call of Duty, but you do need to know what they are, and you do need to know what those games are actually telling, what they're actually representing, the ideas that they're representing, even if they just seem like innocent fun set in kind of a war zone. They just have so much more meaning to that. Anyway, that's enough for this video and this topic for now. I'm sure I will have more to say about it at some stage down the track. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. That way you don't miss any of them. And please do consider backing me on Patreon. I ask every time. It really does help to have that support. And it does allow me to continue to dream about what I'll be doing next with this channel. So thanks again. And thanks as always for watching. And we will see you at the next video.